Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into one of the most powerful, baffling, and sometimes really disruptive experiences you can have. That state of intense romantic fixation we often just call falling in love.
Right.
Think about
Right.
it. This feeling has, well, it's launched ships, written symphonies, brought empires crashing down, changed countless lives. It's everywhere in culture, art, stories.
It really is.
And yet, when you look at like the science, especially focused academic research, there's been this surprising gap, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. We talk about love in so many ways, friendship, family, partnership, but this specific all-consuming state, it often gets dismissed or just poorly defined.
Exactly. We lack precise language for it.
Yeah.
And that's where the source for this deep dive comes in.
It does. We're looking at a paper from 1984 by Dr. Johan Verhulst, and it builds directly on the really groundbreaking work of researcher Dorothy Tennov.
Tennov, okay.
Yeah, she spent years trying to understand this intense state empirically, interviewed hundreds of people, and crucially, she gave it a name.
A specific name for this feeling.
She wanted something neutral, clinical, descriptive,
Right.
free from all the cultural baggage of words like infatuation or arguing if it's real love versus puppy love, that sort of thing.
Okay, so our mission today then is to take Tennov and Verhulst's work and really dive into this specific phenomenon. What it is, how it feels, some maybe surprising theories about its nature and how it typically unfolds over time. We're going to shine a light on that crazy, beautiful, sometimes agonizing thing.
Precisely. And the term we'll be using based on Tennov's research is limerence.
Limerence. Yeah.
It's a descriptive label for that state of being in love that separates it out from, well, other kinds of affection or attachment.
Got it. Limerence. So based on Tennov's research, all those hundreds of interviews, what are the defining characteristics? What makes this state so distinct?
Well, she identified several key criteria. First, and maybe most fundamentally, is this intense emotional dependency.
Dependency. How so?
Your entire emotional state becomes tethered to the person you're limerent for the limerent object or LO.
Right.
The mood swings wildly based entirely on their perceived actions or lack of action, and the hope or fear of reciprocity.
So if you think they like you back, even a little.
You're sky high, intense joy, even ecstasy. But if you fear rejection or indifference,
Oh, boy.
it's absolute despair, a heavy, depressive kind of mood. It's really extreme.
Wow, that emotional whiplash sounds exhausting. Seriously. What else? What else dominates?
Then there's the mental takeover, intrusive preoccupation.
Intrusive thoughts.
Yes, your mind is just constantly, compulsively on the LO. Tennov would actually ask people, what percentage of your waking time is the LO on your mind?
And what did they say?
In deep limerence, people would genuinely say 100%.
100%. Wow.
Yeah. And this isn't just pleasant daydreaming. It's often unwanted, hard to control. It interrupts everything else.
Okay, so it really hijacks your focus.
Completely. The good news is, as limerence starts to fade, this intrusive thinking is usually the first thing to lessen.
Okay, that's something. So your brain is hijacked by thoughts of this person. And I guess all those thoughts revolve around one central desire.
Exactly. That's the core driving force. This intense longing for reciprocity.
Wanting them to feel the same way.
More than anything else, not just like you, but feel the specific intense feeling back. A free, total, exclusive commitment of their feelings towards you.
Okay, and here's a crucial point the paper makes, drawing from Tennov. It's not primarily about sex, is it?
Yes, this is key and often misunderstood. The primary goal isn't necessarily physical or sexual contact. It's the reciprocity of feeling itself.
The feeling is the main thing.
Right. While sexual contact can be incredibly important, it's often most valued as a sign of that desired reciprocity.
Ah, okay, like proof.
Exactly. So limerent jealousy can be totally distinct from sexual jealousy.
How so?
Well, the paper gives this really striking example of a pimp who could be limerent for one of his prostitutes. His distress wouldn't be about her sexual acts with clients. That wasn't the issue for him in terms of limerence. It was the possibility of her developing genuine reciprocal feelings for someone else.
Wow. That really puts the focus squarely on the emotional bond, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
That makes perfect sense now. And I can see how if physical intimacy does happen, it could be incredibly high stakes, so much meaning attached.
Absolutely. The source notes that performance anxiety is very common during sexual contact with a limerent object.
Because it's all tied up with that hope for a sign.
Precisely because it's so intertwined with that desperate hope for a sign of their reciprocal feeling.
Okay, so the core characteristics are clear. Intense emotional dependency, overwhelming intrusive thoughts, and this powerful longing specifically for reciprocal feeling. But you mentioned this isn't something everyone necessarily goes through.
That's a significant finding from Tennov. Limerence is not a universal experience.
Really? Not everyone feels this.
Apparently not in this specific way. Some people seem, hardwired for it. They experience it intensely, frequently throughout their lives. Others experience it rarely, maybe only once.
And then there are people who never feel it.
And then there are people Tennov called non-limerents. They genuinely seem never to experience these specific characteristics, the ecstasy, the despair, the intrusive thoughts, the specific longing for reciprocal feeling.
So they can still love people, have relationships?
Oh, absolutely. They might form stable, loving relationships, but they just don't undergo this particular limerence state.
That's a really important distinction. So someone can be deeply committed and loving without ever experiencing limerence itself.
Precisely. And the paper also touches on pseudo-limerence.
Pseudo-limerence.
Yeah, people who sort of perform the role of being in love based on cultural scripts, They pursue romance, say the right things, but they lack those core internal limerence symptoms like the ecstasy or the despair. They're acting it out, maybe.
Fascinating. So it's like limerence is a specific flavor of intense feeling that not everyone is wired for, or maybe not everyone experiences. What about some of the less central characteristics? Did the paper mention others?
There are a few others mentioned. A notable one is extreme shyness or fear of rejection around the ullo.
Which seems kind of paradoxical given the intensity.
It does, yeah. There's also strong idealization of the ullo, focusing only on the positives, overlooking or rationalizing away negatives, blinding yourself a bit.
Rose-colored glasses, big time.
Definitely. You also typically can't be truly limerent towards more than one person simultaneously. It's very focused.
One ullo at a time.
Right. And maybe most interestingly, the feelings often intensify when faced with adversity or obstacles.
Ah, the classic forbidden love scenario, Romeo and Juliet effect.
Exactly like that. And there's this almost uncanny ability to see what you desperately want to see, isn't there?
You mean interpreting signs?
Yes, the paper notes this striking tendency to interpret even ambiguous or neutral behavior from the LO as secret signs of reciprocal feeling. You construct these elaborate interpretations just to maintain hope.
Building a whole narrative.
Completely. The patient-therapist example is powerful here. A patient becomes limerent for their therapist.
Oh, I see where this is going.
And the therapist's necessary professional neutrality, their exploratory questions, can be endlessly interpreted by the patient as hints of the therapist's own suppressed feelings.
So the ambiguity keeps it going.
Exactly. It can sustain the limerence for years because the ambiguity is never truly resolved by rejection.
Wow, that just highlights how much of the experience is internal, driven by hope, sometimes against all evidence. So these characteristics, the intensity, the idealization, seeking signs, do they show up historically? Is this a new thing?
Absolutely not new. The paper points out how Tennov's descriptions align really strikingly with historical accounts of lovesickness.
Lovesickness.
Yeah.
Like in old poems.
Yeah, like the poems of Sappho in ancient Greece, or that formal, often obsessive, courtly love described by the troubadours in the Middle Ages.
Right, courtly love. With knights and ladies.
Exactly. This suggests limerence isn't just a modern phenomenon. It's a recurring pattern in human experience, even if its expression changes a bit with culture and time.
Okay, so we've defined the state of limerence, its core symptoms. Now, let's get to the really juicy question. What is it, fundamentally? Is it just some kind of immaturity or a psychological glitch, or is it something else entirely?
Right. This moves us into exploring the nature of limerence. One common perspective, which the source discusses, links it strongly to early developmental stages.
Like going back to being a kid.
Kind of. Some researchers see it as a sort of temporary regression, a slip back to pre-Oedipal phases or very early attachment patterns. These are characterized by what's called fusional object relations.
Fusional object relations. Okay, break that down for me.
Yep.
Not too academic.
Sure. Think about a baby and its primary caregiver, like its mother. There's a period where the baby doesn't fully distinguish itself as separate, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense of being merged or fused with the person it's utterly dependent on.
Okay, got that.
In limerence, you see echoes of this. That feeling of blurred boundaries, the internalized image of the allo that feels like part of you, the imaginary conversations you have with them in your head.
Yeah, the constant internal dialogues.
And that intense dependency where separation feels like withdrawal, almost like being addicted to them, the feeling of emptiness if they're not there or not responsive.
That makes sense, that desperate need, feeling like they're essential to your existence.
Exactly. This perspective also links Limerence's sense of timelessness, that feeling that this intensity has always been and will always be forever.
Mm-hmm.
It links that to those early stages where time perception is different.
Interesting. Like it exists outside normal time.
Kind of. And the feeling people often have afterwards, that the experience was discontinuous or almost dreamlike, maybe with some amnesia for the full intensity, that's also linked here.
Like you can't quite grasp how intense it was once it's over.
Right. The paper even notes how intense affective disorders, like severe depression, can feel similarly timeless and are sometimes connected back to these early fusional dynamics.
So theory one, limerence is like our adult brains temporarily reverting to a baby's way of relating to a crucial person. But the paper also presents arguments against just calling it a regression or a deficit, doesn't it?
Yes, there's a counter-argument that complicates that picture quite a bit.
Okay.
The source mentions research suggesting, surprisingly, that self-actualizing individuals, people really achieving their full potential, are actually quite prone to experiencing limerence. That's according to the psychologist Abraham Maslow.
Wait, really? The most fulfilled people get it?
Apparently so, according to Maslow. And some other theorists, like Otto Kernberg, suggest that the capacity for limerence itself is actually a developmental achievement.
An achievement? How?
Well, Kernberg argued that people with severe narcissistic disorders, for example, might actually lack the ability to truly enter this state. They can't achieve that level of idealization and dependency on another.
That's a complete twist. So experiencing limerence isn't necessarily a sign of being immature then?
Not according to these perspectives, no. There's also the idea that limerence, while incredibly intense and maybe destabilizing, can actually be a catalyst for growth and healing sometimes.
A difficult path to growth, maybe?
Potentially. The paper even touches on the idea of cultural bias. Maybe our Western focus on individualism makes us view fusion or dependency negatively.
Whereas other cultures might see it differently.
Exactly. It mentions the Japanese concept of ame.
Ame.
Yeah, it's described as a kind of sweet dependency on another's love, like seeking indulgence from a parent. Apparently, it's very difficult to translate properly into English, which suggests other cultures might integrate these dependent-like feelings more fluidly into relationships.
That cultural lens adds a whole new layer. Fascinating. So if it's not just regression, what's the alternative perspective this source paper proposes? What is limerence then?
Dr. Verhulst's paper proposes viewing limerence as an altered state of consciousness.
An altered state? Like meditation or?
More specifically, an affect-dominated state of mind. This is contrasted with our everyday, ordinary, what he calls the language-dominated state.
Okay, affect-dominated versus language-dominated. Break that down for me. What's the difference?
Well, in our normal state, language helps us structure reality, right? It creates boundaries, subject and predicate, me and you, here and there.
It carves things up.
Exactly. The paper touches on ideas like Lacan's, linking acquiring language to that separation from an early fused sense of the world. Language mediates our experience, puts it into boxes, sequences it.
Okay, standard operating procedure for our brains.
Right, but in affect-dominated states, think being completely lost in powerful music or overwhelmed by intense fear or maybe deep in a fever dream, that language structure kind of breaks down.
The feeling takes over.
The experience feels unmediated, direct, and the distinction between self and non-self can blur or even disappear. That's where the sense of merger comes from.
Okay. So limerence is seen as this intense state where the raw feeling dominates. The usual language-based structure of reality softens. And you experience that merger, that timelessness, that lack of clear boundaries between you and the LO.
That's the hypothesis presented in the paper. It argues this view accounts for the fusional characteristics without necessarily labeling it purely immature.
It respects the intensity of the experience.
Right, and it acknowledges that those early fusional experiences we talked about act as prototypes. They shape the style or the secondary characteristics of your limerence.
I mean,
Like, maybe if you felt abandoned as a child, your adult limerence might have a really strong clinging quality to it. Your personal history flavors it.
gotcha. So the early stuff shapes the how, But the what is this altered state?
What the core state itself is seen as a distinct temporary shift in how your mind processes reality, driven by powerful emotion, by affect.
Okay, that framework is really interesting. An altered state shaped by our past. So, if this is the nature of limerence, how does it typically unfold over time? Is there a common pattern people go through?
Well, based on Tennov's work and Verhulst's model in the paper, the source outlines a proposed 5-phase cycle that the limerence experience often follows. It gives us a way to understand the journey.
A predictable path, sort of. Let's trace that journey. Where does it begin?
It starts, perhaps counterintuitively, before there's even a specific person. Phase 1. Prelimerence.
Prelimerence, so before the LO.
Exactly. This is less about a specific person and more about a state of readiness, a kind of internal longing or susceptibility before the feeling attaches to someone.
What makes someone susceptible?
The paper notes various factors contribute here. Biological readiness, maybe hormones, general arousal levels, but also psychological factors like loneliness, discontent, feeling alienated from your usual life.
Feeling stuck or bored.
Yeah, or even just a strong desire for meaning or intensity. Something's missing.
So you're primed, maybe feeling a bit adrift, and ready for something to happen.
Exactly. And because the readiness is so high, the specific person who becomes the LO can sometimes feel almost contingent, based more on timing and circumstance than their unique qualities.
Right place, right time, when you're already feeling that way.
Precisely. The paper gives examples. Someone bored with their life meets an understanding person at a conference and boom, falls limerent. Or someone in a distant relationship starts therapy, feeling anxious and isolated, and immediately develops strong limerence for the therapist.
Because the therapist is available and seems understanding.
Right. In these cases, the internal state creates a high limerence appeal towards available, potentially responsive individuals.
Got it. You're ready, and then someone triggers that potential. What happens next? Phase 2.
That moves us into phase 2, prereciprocity. This is the often agonizing, sometimes exhilarating phase where you are limerent, but the feeling isn't yet mutual, or at least you don't know for sure.
This is the phase of intense hope and fear.
Absolutely. This is where the intense observation of the LO comes in, looking for any tiny sign, analyzing every word, every glance.
How is limerence usually communicated in this phase? Is it obvious?
Often through nonverbal signals, shy glances, lingering eye contact, blushing, nervous behavior, even dilated pupils, apparently.
The classic signs of attraction may be amplified.
Yes, and the source notes these signals are incredibly potent. They can be very appealing and might actually elicit a response from the LO, drawing them in.
And what happens depends heavily on that response from the LO.
Crucially, yes. If the LO gives clear, unequivocal rejection, a polite but firm no, or obvious disinterest, the limerent person will experience that despair we talked about.
Yeah.
But typically the feeling will gradually fade and they'll return to that prelimerance state, ready again eventually.
So rejection, while painful, actually ends it.
Usually. However, if the LO's reaction is ambiguous or neutral or even unintentionally mildly encouraging, this can act like fuel on the fire. It intensely prolongs the pre-reciprocity phase, potentially for years.
Years. Just based on ambiguity.
Yes, precisely because it feeds the hope and allows for endless interpretation. That patient-therapist example again. The therapist's necessary neutrality can be misread as hidden interest, trapping the patient in hope indefinitely.
So ambiguity is the ultimate sustainer of this intense, hopeful state. But if those nonverbal signals are reciprocated, if the LO starts feeling it too.
And then you transition into phase 3, reciprocity. This is a state of mutual limerence. Bliss, potentially.
Both people are in that intense state together. How long does that last?
The paper notes its duration varies wildly. Could be just days, could be a few years.
And this phase serves a purpose.
This is often seen as serving a crucial function in pair bonding. It's the intense glue, the rocket fuel, that helps two individuals form a strong initial connection. Some theories link this back to our sociobiological history, needing that intense bond to raise offspring, perhaps.
It gets the relationship off the ground with incredible energy.
Exactly. The source also points out that external adversity or uncertainty in the relationship up to a point can actually help sustain this phase.
Like us against the world.
Kind of. And also physical separation can help sustain it.
Really? Being apart keeps it going.
It can, because it allows the idealization and fantasy to flourish without being constantly challenged by everyday reality, the mundane stuff. Distance keeps the idealized image intact.
So distance can actually keep the limerence burning brighter, in a way.
It certainly can help maintain that affect-driven, idealized state. But eventually, even mutual limerence tends to run its course. It doesn't usually last forever at that peak intensity.
Which leads us, I suppose, to the next phase, the come down.
Which leads us to phase 4, limerence dissolution.
Dissolution. Sounds ominous.
Well, limerence is generally a self-limiting state. Tennov's research estimated the average duration was somewhere around 2 years.
2 years, on average. Okay.
As that affect-dominated state naturally starts to soften, and the more rational, language-mediated part of the self regains its footing, the intensity fades.
Reality starts creeping back in.
You could say that. And this can be a really difficult phase, especially for couples, because the very foundation their relationship is built on seems to be shifting or disappearing. The magic feels like it's going.
That sounds like a critical juncture, a real potential crisis point. How do people typically react when that intense feeling starts to fade?
The source outlines several potential responses, several paths people might take. One is blaming.
Blaming who?
Either the partner, you're not the person I thought you were, you've changed. Or oneself, I must have made a mistake, it wasn't real love. The lack of limerence is seen as a failure.
Because they believe that intensity should last forever.
Exactly. They cling to the cultural ideal of everlasting limerent love, and often retreat back to the prelimerence phase, seeking that next intense feeling with someone new, always chasing the high.
A cycle of chasing that initial spark. What's another reaction?
Another reaction is to cling to the image of limerence. The feelings aren't there anymore, the intensity is gone, but they desperately act as if they are.
Faking it till you make it. Or just faking it.
More like just faking it. They might double down on idealizing the partner, avoid conflict at all costs, trying to smooth everything over to maintain the appearance of being madly in love.
Putting on a performance.
Right. The paper notes this leads to contrived, inauthentic interactions, trying harder and harder to force a feeling that just isn't there anymore. This kind of pseudo-limerence behavior can be incredibly draining and unsatisfying.
That sounds deeply unsustainable and potentially really painful for everyone involved.
It often is. And these cases can sometimes be what brings couples into therapy, maybe when the pressure breaks through something like an affair or just sheer exhaustion.
Okay, so blaming or faking it.
Yeah.
Is there a more adaptive way to handle dissolution?
Yes. The third, more adaptive reaction described is adopting a position of faith.
A position of faith. What does that mean?
This involves accepting that limerence is finite, recognizing it as a powerful, maybe wonderful, but time-limited state, letting go of the idea that this initial intensity must last forever.
Accepting it was real, but it's changing.
Exactly. It's letting go of that core illusion, as the paper puts it, to allow for something else, something different, to develop in its place.
Accepting the natural end of the initial intensity to build a different kind of connection.
Precisely. It's seen as a more mature adaptation. It paves the way for a different stage of relating, potentially deeper and more stable.
Okay. And you mentioned a special case. When it fades for one person but not the other.
Right. The paper also mentions the special, often difficult case of asymmetrical dissolution, where one partner's limerence fades much faster or much earlier than the others.
Oh, that sounds tough.
It can create this persistent, often painful interaction cycle. The non-limerent partner maybe withdraws from the limerent one's continued intensity or clinginess.
Which makes the limerent one feel rejected.
Right. They feel despair and maybe pull back themselves. Then the non-limerent partner might feel relief, or maybe guilt, and approaches again slightly.
Giving the limerent person hope again.
Exactly, which reignites their intensity, leading to more clinginess, and the whole cycle repeats. Push and pull.
Wow. That sounds like it could go on for a long time.
Tennov documented a case where this kind of pattern sustained one partner's limerence for an astonishing 25 years.
25 years?
Yeah.
Wow. That just highlights how powerful these dynamics can be, especially when they're mismatched. But assuming dissolution happens for one or both, what's the final phase?
We arrive at phase 5, postlimerence.
After limerence.
Right. This stage, if navigated successfully, is described as an opportunity for growth and reintegration. The intense, sometimes destabilizing experience of limerence can actually act as a sort of developmental crisis that pushes individuals towards change, towards maturity maybe.
Learning from the intensity.
Hopefully. Successful post-limerence is characterized by stable pair bonding. This isn't the affect-driven intensity of limerence anymore.
So what is it built on?
It's built on strong attachment, a personal commitment that endures beyond the initial state, mutual attraction that persists in a different way, open communication, and, importantly, collaborative problem solving. Dealing with real life together.
So it's about building a lasting relationship based on a different kind of foundation than that initial overwhelming feeling, a more stable, chosen connection.
Yes. And the paper notes that failing to successfully transition through this phase, maybe getting stuck in blame or pseudo-limerence, often leads to continued alienation within the relationship, or conflict-driven dynamics.
Or going back to the start.
Or individuals repeatedly cycling back to the prelimerence stage, constantly searching for that next limerent fix, that next intense high.
Understanding this cycle isn't just academic then. It feels incredibly relevant to why relationships succeed or fail after that initial honeymoon phase fades.
Absolutely. And that really brings us to why understanding limerence, as described in this work by Tennov and Verhulst, is so vital. It's crucial for understanding human development, how we form attachments.
And especially for therapists.
Oh, particularly its immense clinical relevance. Therapists are constantly dealing with the fallout or the process of love's power, the intensity of limerence at the start, the anxiety and conflict during dissolution, and the challenge of building something stable afterwards. It feels like a foundational concept for anyone working in relationship counseling.
It truly does. And the source points to the need for more research, right? Like understanding differences.
Definitely. Exploring differences across genders, cultures, maybe different age groups or life stages. There's still a lot to learn.
In the idea of it being an altered state.
Yeah. The theoretical value of viewing limerence as a specific, affect-dominated altered state is significant. The paper suggests this model could be incredibly useful for studying other intense psychological states that share similar qualities, that feeling of merger, or feeling unmediated by language.
Like what?
Potentially including aspects of major depression, certain forms of addiction, maybe even some psychotic states. Seeing those potential connections, that common ground in altered states of mind, is really thought-provoking.
That's a powerful link to draw, potentially unifying different intense experiences.
And finally, the paper really emphasizes the importance for everyone, not just clinicians, to take this phenomenon seriously.
To acknowledge it exists and talk about it.
Yes. We need to move past any taboos or embarrassment about discussing this intense state and its effects, and help ourselves and others navigate its complexities, both when we're caught in its grip and, maybe just as importantly, when that grip starts to loosen.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up then. We've taken a really deep dive into the work of Tennov and Verhulst to unpack limerence. That specific intense state defined by emotional dependency, those intrusive thoughts, and that fierce longing for reciprocal feeling.
Mm-hmm. The core components.
We've explored different ideas about its nature. Is it like going back to early developmental merger? Or is it maybe better understood as a distinct, affect-dominated, altered state of mind, perhaps shaped by our personal history?
Two really interesting ways to frame it.
And we've mapped out that typical, often turbulent 5-phase journey it can take people on. From that initial readiness, the prelimerence, right, through the push and pull of hoping for and maybe experiencing reciprocity.
The intense highs and lows there.
Into the, well, usually inevitable phase of dissolution, where the intensity fades.
A critical transition point.
And hopefully towards a more stable post-limerence connection built on something different.
It's a journey from that intense, affect-driven merger to finding, hopefully, a different kind of enduring bond.
So here's a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to sit with. How might acknowledging limerence as this specific